March 1944. The mountains of central Italy stood like broken teeth against a moonless sky, their slopes scarred by artillery, and their valleys choked with winter fog that never fully lifted. Along the Gustav Line, where German forces had dug themselves into positions so formidable that Allied commanders spoke in whispers about acceptable casualty rates, the nights belonged to the hunters. Small teams of enemy scouts moved through the darkness like ghosts, probing American positions, cutting communication lines, marking targets for dawn mortars. They operated in silence, speaking only in hand signals, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle footfalls on rocky ground. For the men of the 133rd Infantry Regiment, sleep came in nervous fragments, always one ear listening for the scrape of a boot or the metallic click that meant someone had found your foxhole before you found them. Sergeant Thomas Keane had heard those sounds before. 3 weeks earlier, his best friend had died 15 feet from command post, throat cut so quietly that the man in the next foxhole didn't realize anything was wrong until morning light revealed the body. 2 nights after that, an entire observation post for men vanished without firing a shot. They found the bodies at dawn, arranged in a neat line as if the enemy scouts wanted to send a message about their efficiency. The brass called it infiltration tactics. The men in the trenches had uglier names for it. Names spoken with the kind of fear that comes from knowing your enemy owns the night. Keane was 26 years old, a farm kid from Nebraska who had joined up the day after Pearl Harbor with romantic notions about defending freedom that had since been ground into the Italian mud along with everything else. He had been assigned to the armory section not because of any particular mechanical aptitude, but because a piece of shrapnel had torn through his left shoulder during the Salerno landing, leaving him with limited range of motion and a ticket out of frontline rifle companies. The wound had healed badly, the kind of healing that left you functional but fundamentally changed. He could still shoot, still fight if he had to, but the Army had decided his value lay elsewhere. So he maintained weapons, fitted replacements, cleaned the mechanisms that other men would use to stay alive. It was supposed to be safer. It wasn't supposed to involve the kind of problem that woke him at night with his heart hammering against his ribs. The problem had started with a rifle that shouldn't have been his concern. A corporal from Easy Company had brought in an M1 carbine with a damaged bolt, the result of a misfire that had cracked the locking lugs and bent the extractor claw. Standard procedure was simple. Tag the rifle as deadlined, pull the bolt, requisition a replacement, move on to the next weapon in the endless queue of equipment that needed attention. But replacements were scarce that winter. Supply lines stretched in across mountains at 8 trucks and turned roads into rivers of mud. Keane had 3 damaged bolts sitting in a parts bin, and no new ones coming for at least 2 weeks. Men were going on patrol with weapons that misfired or jammed, and the nightly toll of bodies kept climbing. So he had done what mechanics do when official channels fail. He improvised. The damaged bolt could be salvaged, he thought, if he could file down the damaged lugs and retention the extractor spring. It would take precision work, careful measurement with calipers, testing and retesting until the timing was perfect. He set up in the core of the supply tent that served as his workshop, a canvas roof space that smelled of gun oil and dampness, lit by a single kerosene lamp that threw dancing shadows across his workbench. Outside, artillery rumbled in the distance like an approaching storm that never quite arrived. He worked through the afternoon, filing metal by hand, checking clearances, his damaged shoulder aching from the repetitive motion. The bolt had to seat properly, had to lock tight when the action cycled, had to extract spent casings without failure. But something was wrong. When he manually cycled the action, testing the fit, the bolt slid forward with almost no sound. The normal metallic clack of the M1 carbine's operation, the distinctive noise that every soldier knew, the sound that marked you as American in the darkness, was gone. Instead, there was only a soft whisper of metal on metal, so quiet that it barely carried across the tent. Keane froze, his hand still on the rifle. He cycled the action again, slowly listening. The same result. The bolt moved like liquid, smooth and nearly silent. He had accidentally created something that shouldn't exist. A rifle that could chamber round without announcing itself to everyone within 50 yards. His first thought was that he had made a mistake, that the bolt wasn't locking properly, that the weapon would blow up in someone's face. He spent the next hour testing headspace with gauges, checking lug engagement, examining every surface for signs of excessive wear. Everything checked out. The bolt locked solidly. The firing pin struck true. The extraction was positive. By every measure that mattered, the rifle was functional, but it was silent. And silence in a weapon designed to make noise was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with mechanical failure. He took the rifle to the makeshift range behind the supply area, a berm of sandbags where armor tested weapons away from the main camp. He loaded 5 rounds, standard military ball ammunition, and fired. The reports echoed across the valley, drawing annoyed looks from men trying to sleep in nearby tents. But between those reports, as he worked the action to chamber each new round, there was almost nothing. Just that whisper, that soft sliding that could barely be heard over the sound of his own breathing. A normal M1 carbine announced each cycling with authority. This one moved like a secret. Keane ejected the magazine and field-stripped the weapon on a supply crate, laying out each component for inspection. The bolt showed no signs of stress. The barrel was clean. The chamber was undamaged. He had created something that worked better than it should, and he had no idea if that made it brilliant or catastrophic. His instinct, the farm kid instinct that kept him alive through North Africa and Sicily and the nightmare of Salerno Beach, told him this was important. But his training, the Army regulations that had been drilled into him through basic and armor school, told him this was unauthorized modification, the kind of thing that could get him court-martialed if someone got hurt. He reassembled the rifle and took it back to his tent, wrapping it in a canvas tarp and shoving it under his cot. He would report it in the morning, he told himself. He would show it to Lieutenant Morrison, explain what had happened, let the officers decide what to do with it. That was the proper procedure. That was what you did when you stumbled across something that didn't fit the manual. But that night, lying in his bedroll with the sound of distant small arms fire crackling through the darkness, he kept thinking about the observation post. For men, kill without a sound, because the enemy owned silence and American forces didn't. He thought about the scouts who moved through the night like predators, about the way every American weapon announced itself, about the bodies that kept appearing at dawn. And he thought about the rifle under his cot, wrapped in canvas, capable of things that shouldn't be possible. Morning came with the usual chaos of a forward position, breakfast from tin cans, status reports shouted over the rumble of supply trucks, orders changing 3 times before anyone could act on them. Keane reported to the armory tent with the wrapped rifle, intending to show Lieutenant Morrison before the daily briefing. But Morrison was gone, called back to battalion headquarters for meetings about the next offensive push. The assistant armorer, a PFC named Daniels, who cared more about staying warm than weapon specifications, barely looked up when Keane asked about procedure for reporting modified equipment. Brass is worried about the big push, not about your pet projects, Daniels said, hunched over a portable stove that put out more smoke than heat. You got rifles that need fixing, fix them. You got rifles that work, issue them. Everything else can wait until we're not about to get overrun. Keane stood in the entrance of the tent, the wrapped rifle in his hands, feeling the weight of a decision he hadn't meant to make. The proper channel had closed. He could push harder, demand to see Morrison whenever he returned, file a formal report to the chain of command. But that would take days, maybe weeks, and in the meantime, the rifle would sit in his tent doing nothing while men went on patrol with equipment that betrayed their position every time they cycled around. He made a choice that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He would test it himself, not in combat. He wasn't stupid enough to trust an unproven modification in a firefight, but on a patrol, a simple perimeter check where the stakes were low and he could evaluate the weapon's performance under field conditions. If it worked, he would have concrete evidence to present to Morrison. If it failed, he would be the only casualty of his own experiment. It was the kind of logic that made sense at 4 a.m. when you hadn't slept properly in weeks. Getting assigned to a patrol was easier than it should have been. The regiment was stretched thin, rotating men through night watch on a schedule that left everyone exhausted. When Keane volunteered to tag along with a routine perimeter sweep, officially to check on weapon performance in field conditions, which wasn't entirely a lie, the patrol sergeant barely blinked. They needed bodies, and Keane was a warm body with a rifle. The fact that the rifle was unusual didn't come up because he didn't mention it. The patrol consisted of 8 men. The sergeant, 6 riflemen from different companies thrown together by the demands of the duty roster, and Keane. They were assigned a sector along the eastern approach to the regimental position, a stretch of rocky hillside dotted with scrub pine and shell craters that provided excellent concealment for anyone approaching from the German lines. Intelligence reported low enemy activity in the area, which meant nothing. Intelligence had reported low activity before the observation post-massacre too. They moved out at 2200 hours, just after full darkness settled over the mountains. No moon, heavy cloud cover, visibility reduced to maybe 20 feet even with eyes adjusted to the dark. The patrol sergeant, a wiry Texan named Horvath who had survived since North Africa by trusting nothing and no one, set a slow pace. They moved in a loose file, each man far enough from the next to avoid being caught in the same burst of fire, close enough to maintain visual contact through the gloom. No talking, no smoking, no unnecessary noise. Every sound was a potential death sentence. Keane moved near the middle of the formation, the modified carbine held at low ready, his thumb resting on the safety. The weapon felt normal in his hands, balanced and familiar despite the altered bolt. He had fired maybe 30 rounds through it at the range, enough to confirm it functioned, not enough to develop real confidence. Now, moving through enemy territory with lives potentially depending on equipment he had modified in a supply tent, the enormity of what he was doing settled over him like cold water. They covered the first hour of patrol without incident, sweeping through their assigned sector in overlapping arcs, checking likely infiltration routes, and listening posts. Horvath was thorough, almost obsessively careful, pausing frequently to listen, to watch, to read the darkness for signs that something was wrong. Twice he called a halt and made the patrol freeze for 5 solid minutes, everyone's heart hammering, because he thought he heard movement. Both times it was nothing, just wind in the rocks or a piece of shrapnel settling in a crater. But the tension never broke. Everyone knew the stories. Everyone had lost friends to the silence. They were 40 minutes into the return leg, moving through a shallow ravine that would take them back to American lines, when Horvath's hand went up in the signal for immediate freeze. The patrol dropped as one, each man finding whatever covered terrain offered. Keane pressed himself against the boulder, the carbine across his chest, and listened so hard his ears rang with the effort. At first, nothing, just the ambient sounds of a winter night in the mountains, wind, distant artillery, the faint rustle of his own breathing. Then he heard it, a soft scuff of boot on stone, maybe 30 yards ahead and to the right. Then another sound, closer, the faint clink of equipment rubbing against itself. Someone was moving parallel to their position, and they were trying to be quiet. Keane's stomach dropped. Either they had stumbled into an enemy patrol, or an enemy patrol had stumbled into them, and either way the next few seconds would determine who walked away. Horvath was already moving, using hand signals that were barely visible in the darkness. He pointed to 3 men, then pointed up the slope to the right, indicating a flanking movement. He pointed to 2 more men, indicated they should hold position and provide covering fire if needed. Then he pointed at Keane and gestured him forward, up toward the sound of movement. Keane's mind raced. Why him? Then he understood. Horvath had seen his carbine, knew it was different somehow, and was gambling that whatever made it different might matter in a situation where noise discipline was everything. Keane moved forward in a combat crouch, each step placed with agonizing care. The modified carbine felt slick in his sweating hands. He had never killed anyone at close range, had never been in a situation where silence was the difference between survival and annihilation. His training screamed at him that this was wrong, that he should fall back, call for artillery support, do anything except move toward enemy soldiers with an untested weapon. But Horvath's orders had been clear, and in combat you followed orders even when your brain was drowning in fear. He cleared the edge of a rock outcropping and saw them, for shapes, darker against the darkness, moving in careful bounds down the ravine. German scouts. He was certain, probably the advanced element of a larger infiltration. They wore the smocks and soft caps favored by reconnaissance units, carried suppressed submachine guns and knives, moved with the practiced silence of men who had done this 100 times. They hadn't seen him yet, were focused on the ravine floor where Horvath and the others were, concealed. Keane's combat instinct made the decision before his conscious mind caught up. If he fired now, the muzzle flash and report would alert every enemy soldier within a quarter mile. The scouts would scatter or return fire, and the patrol would be caught in a running firefight in darkness against an unknown number of hostiles. Even if they won, men would die. The proper response was to withdraw, call in coordinates, let artillery handle it. But there was no time for proper responses. The lead scout was 20 feet away and closing, would stumble into Horvath's position in seconds. He raised a carbine, sighted on the lead scout's center mass, and squeezed the trigger. The report cracked through the night, impossibly loud, and the scout dropped without a sound. Keane worked the action, felt the bolt slide forward with that whispered smoothness, and fired again. The second scout spun and fell. The third scout was turning, bringing his weapon up, when Keane's third round caught him high in the chest. 3 seconds, 3 shots, 3 bodies, and now the night erupted with noise as Horvath and patrol opened fire on targets they could barely see. But something was wrong. Keane's mind, operating on pure adrenaline and combat reflex, registered a discrepancy. The scouts had reacted to his first shot, as expected, but after that, something changed. The fourth scout, instead of taking cover or returning fire, was looking around wildly, trying to locate the source of incoming rounds. He couldn't place it. The muzzle flash from Keane's position was visible, but the cycling of the bolt, the sound that normally accompanied every shot and gave away a rifleman's position as clearly as a beacon, was absent. The scout was hearing shots, but not hearing the follow-up sounds that told him where they originated from. Keane fired again, and the fourth scout dropped, for enemy soldiers down in maybe 6 seconds, and suddenly the ravine was silent, except for the ringing in Keane's ears and the harsh breathing of the patrol members around him. Horvath materialized out of the darkness, his Thompson submachine gun still trained on the fallen scouts, his face a mask of controlled shock. What the hell was that? Horvath whispered, his voice barely audible. You just dropped 4 hostiles faster than I could count. Keane opened his mouth to respond, but movement ahead cut him off. More shapes in the darkness. At least 6, maybe more, moving down the ravine toward their position. The main enemy force, drawn by the sound of shooting. The scouts had been the advance element, and now the hunters were coming. Horvath made a rapid series of hand signals. Fall back, maintain noise discipline, prepare for contact. The patrol began to withdraw in good order, each man covering the next, weapons trained on the ravine. But the modified carbine had given Keane an idea, a terrible idea born of desperation, and the sudden understanding of what his accidental discovery could do. He grabbed Horvath's shoulder and leaned in close, whispering directly into the sergeant's ear. Give me 2 minutes. Keep them off my back. I can end this. Horvath stared at him like he was insane, which was probably accurate. But the sergeant had survived 18 months of combat by knowing when to trust his instincts, and something in Keane's voice must have convinced him. He nodded once, sharply, and signaled the patrol to form a defensive perimeter. Keane moved away from the group, working his way up the slope to a position that overlooked the ravine, a spot where he could see without being silhouetted against the sky. The enemy's soldiers were moving more cautiously now, aware that something had happened to their scout team, but not sure what. They were spread out, using proper tactical spacing, weapons at the ready. Keane counted 7 men, all of them moving with the confidence of veterans who owned the night. Under normal circumstances, 8 American soldiers stumbling into 7 German scouts would result in a vicious close-quarters firefight with casualties on both sides. The Americans would probably win through superior firepower, but men would die in the process. Keane settled into a prone position behind a fallen tree, the carbine stock pressed tight to his shoulder. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth, but his hands were steady. Years of hunting deer in Nebraska cornfields had taught him patience, had taught him how to control his breathing, how to wait for the perfect shot. He picked his first target, the leftmost soldier in the advancing line, and fired. The man dropped. He cycled the bolt, that whisper of metal on metal, and fired again. Another soldier fell. The remaining enemy soldiers froze, trying to locate the threat. They had heard the shots, but in the chaos of the ravine with its rock walls and multiple echoes, They couldn't pinpoint Keane's position, and critically, they weren't hearing the cycling of his weapon between shots. To their ears, it sounded like multiple shooters firing from different positions, a coordinated ambush rather than a single rifleman. They began to retreat, moving back up the ravine toward their own lines, firing blind suppression bursts that went nowhere near Keane's position. He fired again, dropped a third soldier, cycled the bolt, fired, dropped a fourth. The remaining 3 enemy soldiers broke and ran, abandoning their wounded, abandoning the bodies of the scout team, fleeing back toward German lines with the kind of panic that comes from being hunted by something you can't see or hear clearly. Keane let them go. He had accomplished what he needed to accomplish. 7 enemy soldiers neutralized without a single American casualty, without calling down artillery that would alert every German unit in the sector. He slid back down the slope to where Horvath and the patrol waited, their weapons trained on the ravine, their faces showing the strain of men who had expected to die in the next few seconds. Horvath grabbed him by the shoulder, hard enough to hurt, his expression caught between fury and amazement. "You're going to explain that," Horvath said, and it was a request. The patrol withdrew to American lines in double time, hauling the bodies of 2 German scouts for intelligence purposes, leaving the rest for recovery teams. They crossed into the safety of the defensive perimeter just before midnight, exhausted and wired on adrenaline. Keane expected to be pulled aside immediately, expected questions about his weapon and his actions. Instead, Horvath took him directly to the command post, bypassing normal after-action procedures, and demanded an immediate meeting with Lieutenant Morrison. Morrison had returned from battalion headquarters an hour earlier, was trying to catch a few hours of sleep before the dawn briefing. He emerged from his tent looking haggard and irritated, ready to dress down whoever had disturbed him. But Horvath didn't give him the chance. In clipped, efficient sentences, he described the patrol, the contact, and what Keane had done with the modified carbine. Morrison's expression shifted from irritation to attention to something that looked like calculation. "Show me the weapon," Morrison said, his voice flat and controlled in the way of officers who were thinking 3 moves ahead. Keane handed over the carbine. Magazine removed, action locked open in the safe position. Morrison examined it under the light of a gas lantern, his fingers tracing the modified bolt, checking the fitment, testing the action. He cycled the bolt manually, slowly, and his eyebrows went up at the near silence. He did it again, faster, and Keane saw the moment when understanding hit the lieutenant. Morrison had been an infantry officer before transferring to logistics, had led men through North Africa, understood intimately what noise meant in combat. "You made this?" Morrison asked, his eyes on Keane. "By accident, sir. I was repairing a damaged bolt. Got the clearances wrong. Or maybe right. I'm not sure which." Morrison cycled the action again, then looked at Horvath. "You're certain about what happened out there?" He engaged multiple hostiles with this weapon, and they couldn't pinpoint his location. "Positive, sir. I watched him drop 4 scouts in maybe 6 seconds, then engage the main force from an elevated position. The enemy had no idea where he was. They were shooting at ghosts." Morrison set the rifle down carefully, as if it might explode. "This is unauthorized modification of military equipment. By regulations, I should confiscate this weapon, file a report, and possibly bring charges for endangering personnel with untested equipment." Keane's stomach dropped. He had expected recognition, maybe gratitude. He had saved the patrol, had proven the concept. But Morrison was right. Regulations existed for reasons, and he had violated them thoroughly. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but Morrison held up a hand. "However," the lieutenant continued, "regulations also require me to evaluate field innovations that provide tactical advantage. Sergeant Horvath, how many American casualties tonight?" "0, sir." "And enemy casualties?" 11 confirmed. For scouts, 7 main force elements, all attributed to Sergeant Keane's actions with the modified weapon. Morrison nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through implications. "Here's what's going to happen. Sergeant Keane, you're going to write down exactly what you did to that bolt. Every measurement, every modification, every step of the process. Then you're going to teach me how to replicate it. We have 15 damaged bolts in the parts bin, and I want every one of them converted to this configuration by tomorrow night. Sir, I should mention that Command might not approve. Command, Morrison interrupted, loses an average of 4 men per night to enemy scouts in this sector alone. Across the regiment, we're taking 30 to 40 casualties per week from infiltration tactics. If this modification can reduce those losses even by half, I'll take the court-martial myself if it comes to that. But first, we're going to test it properly. Over the next 36 hours, Keane worked almost without sleep, converting damaged bolts using the same careful filing and tensioning that had created the first one. It was painstaking work, requiring precision measurement and constant testing, but the process was replicable. By the second night, he had 12 functioning silent cycle carbines, each one tested and verified. Morrison assigned them to patrol volunteers, men who understood they were carrying experimental equipment and accepted the risk because they also understood the potential. The results were immediate and dramatic. Patrols equipped with the modified carbines reported enemy contact with unprecedented success rates. Scouts who had operated with impunity suddenly found themselves hunted by soldiers they couldn't hear cycling rounds. The psychological effect was devastating. German reconnaissance units, accustomed to owning the night through superior stealth training, began reporting American patrols that moved like ghosts and could engage without giving away positions. After 2 weeks, enemy infiltration attempts in the 133 RD's sector dropped by 60%, but success bred problems. Word of the modified weapons spread to the regiment, then to adjacent units, then up the chain of command. 3 weeks after the initial patrol, Keane found himself standing at attention in front of a full colonel from Divisional Ordnance, flanked by 2 captains who looked at him like he was either a genius or a saboteur. The colonel, a career officer named Brennan who had spent more time in arsenals and combat zones, held one of the modified carbines with the expression of a man examining a poisonous snake. "Sergeant Keane," Brennan said, his voice clipped with Boston accent and barely controlled anger, "do you have any idea what you've done? This weapon violates at least 6 ordnance regulations. The bolt lugs are out of specification. The headspace is marginal. The timing could fail catastrophically, resulting in out-of-battery detonation that would take the shooter's face off. And you produced 12 of these disasters and distributed them to frontline personnel without proper testing protocols or safety certification." Keane kept his eyes forward, his voice level. "Yes, sir, I'm aware of the risks. But I'm also aware that we've reduced infiltration casualties by more than half since deployment. Every man carrying these weapons is alive today because they can engage the enemy without broadcasting their position. Anecdotal evidence is not a substitute for engineering analysis," Brennan snapped. "I'm ordering immediate confiscation of all modified weapons. Any soldier found carrying non-standard equipment will face disciplinary action. This experiment ends now." Lieutenant Morrison, standing to the side of the room, cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, those weapons are currently deployed on patrol. Recalling them immediately could compromise operational security and put men at risk during equipment transition." Brennan turned on Morrison with the kind of fury that only staff officers who felt their authority challenged could muster. "Lieutenant, are you suggesting I don't understand tactical realities?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting that the tactical realities on the ground might not align with ordnance regulations written in rear area facilities." The room went silent. Challenging a colonel, even politely, was a career-ending move. Keane watched Morrison's military future evaporate in real time and felt sick. This was his fault, his modification, his decision to test it in the field. Morrison was taking the fall for following through on Keane's innovation. But then Brennan did something unexpected. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair and rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking less like an angry colonel and more like an exhausted man trying to solve an impossible problem. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. "Off the record, gentlemen. Completely off the record. I have reports from 3 other divisions describing similar modifications, all independently discovered by armorers trying to repair damaged bolts. Some versions work. Some have resulted in weapon failures that injured personnel. We have no standardized procedure, no quality control, No way to separate the safe modifications from the dangerous ones. And meanwhile, I have battalion commanders screaming at me that their men are dying to enemy scouts while we sit on a potential solution because it doesn't fit the manual. He looked at Keane directly, and there was something in his expression that might have been respect. Your version works. I've reviewed the after-action reports, examined the weapons, even fired one myself at the test range. It's brilliant. It's also completely unauthorized, and I cannot officially approve it because if I do, I'm setting a precedent that any mechanic with a file can start modifying weapons without oversight. So what happens now, sir? Keane asked, genuinely confused about whether he was about to be commended or arrested. Brennan stood and paced a small room, his hands clasped behind his back in the classic pose an officer thinking out loud. What happens is that I confiscate these weapons, as required by regulations. I file a report stating that unauthorized modifications were discovered and corrected. That report will make its way through channels and eventually be filed away in some archive where no one will ever read it. He paused, turned to face both Keane and Morrison. But before I confiscate these specific weapons, I'm going to need at least 48 hours to arrange transportation and proper documentation. During that 48 hours, it would be impossible for me to prevent these weapons from being used on already scheduled patrols, since recalling equipment from active operations would compromise tactical effectiveness. And if, during those 48 hours, someone were to accidentally leave detailed technical specifications for the modification process in the Divisional Ordnance Office, where they might be discovered by armorers from other units who were looking for solutions to similar problems, well, I couldn't be held responsible for what people found lying around. Morrison caught on first, his expression shifting from resignation to cautious hope. So you're saying the official record will show confiscation and termination of the program, but the unofficial reality will be continued deployment and information sharing. I'm saying, Brennan replied carefully, that the Army runs on two parallel systems, official policy and field reality. Official policy requires me to shut this down. Field reality requires me to keep soldiers alive. I've learned that sometimes the best thing a staff officer can do is move slowly enough that the field has time to adapt before policy catches up. Keane felt something unodd in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Sergeant. Thank the 200 men who are alive today because you had the sense to test your idea and the courage to use it when it mattered. Now, both of you are dismissed. And Keane, when you write up those technical specifications, be very precise. Other armorers need to replicate this exactly, not approximately. Lives depend on getting the details right. The 48 hours that Brennan promised stretched into 3 weeks as bureaucratic processes move at their characteristic glacial pace. During that time, Keane trained 6 armorers from different regiments, walking them through each step of the modification process, emphasizing the measurements that mattered and the tolerances that couldn't be compromised. The silent carbines proliferated through 5th Army units operating in the Italian mountains, never officially authorized but never quite forbidden either. Enemy after-action reports, captured later in the war, would describe American night patrols in early 1944 as demonstrating irregular weapon characteristics inconsistent with known armament. German scout units reported increasing casualties and decreasing effectiveness, attributing losses to improved enemy night fighting doctrine without understanding that the doctrine hadn't changed, only the tools. By April 1944, infiltration casualties in divisions employing the modified carbines had dropped by nearly 70% compared to units still using standard equipment, but the success remained invisible in official records. The modified carbines were never assigned a formal designation, never appeared in ordnance manuals, never received the kind of recognition that innovations like the bazooka or proximity fuse enjoyed. Men who carried them knew they had an edge, but they couldn't explain why in after-action reports because the weapons officially didn't exist. Armorers who produced them kept their methods quiet, passing along the knowledge through informal networks that operated below the radar of official channels. Keane himself remained a sergeant in an armory section, filing reports about routine weapon maintenance, saying nothing about the nights he spent training other mechanics in the art of converting damaged bolts into silent cycling mechanisms. He received no medals, no commendations, no recognition beyond the occasional nod from a patrol sergeant who understood that the weapon he carried was different and that difference had saved his life. It was enough. Keane had never joined the Army for glory. He had joined because men like his friend, the one who died with his throat cut 15 feet from safety, deserved better than to be hunted in the darkness by an enemy they couldn't hear. The war moved on. The Fifth Army broke through the Gustav Line in May, fought through Rome in June, ground northward to the mountains toward the Po Valley. The modified carbines went with them, carried by men who never knew the name of the mechanic, who had accidentally discovered that a damaged bolt, properly tuned, could cycle without sound. Some of those weapons survived the war, made at home with veterans who kept them as souvenirs, never realizing they were carrying pieces of unauthorized history. One carbine ended up in a private collection in Oregon, purchased at an estate sale by a collector who noticed the unusual bolt configuration. He sent photographs to military historians, asking if anyone could explain the modification. No one could. The official explanation was that it was battlefield damage, improper repair work, something that shouldn't have functioned but somehow did. The collector kept it in a display case with a handwritten note. M1 carbine, Italian campaign, unknown modification. Thomas Keane mustered out in December 1945, returned to Nebraska, married his hometown sweetheart, and took over his father's farm. He never spoke about the war except in the vaguest terms, the way many veterans didn't. When his children asked what he had done in the Army, he said he had repaired weapons and helped keep equipment running. It was technically true. It was also wildly incomplete, but completeness wasn't the point. The point was coming home, building a life, raising children who would never have to crouch in a foxhole listening for the sound of a boot on stone. He died in 1987 at the age of 69, surrounded by family. His war service summarized in a 2-line obituary that mentioned the Bronze Star he had received for meritorious service in a combat zone. The citation for that Bronze Star, filed away in military archives, was deliberately vague about what the meritorious service had entailed. It mentioned technical innovation under combat conditions and initiative in solving operational problems, but it never mentioned carbines or bolts or the 100-plus soldiers who walked away from patrols that should have killed them. Years later, a military researcher combing through casualty statistics from the Italian campaign noticed an anomaly. In early 1944, infiltration casualties in several Fifth Army units dropped precipitously over a 3-week period, with no corresponding change in enemy tactics or American doctrine. The researcher flagged it as a statistical curiosity, possibly related to German supply problems or American air superiority, and moved on to other data. He never connected the casualty reduction to reports of unauthorized weapon modifications, because those reports had been carefully buried under layers of bureaucratic language designed to protect the officers who had looked the other way. The true story remained fragmented, scattered across fading memories and deliberately obscure paperwork, known completely by no one except the men who had carried the weapons and understood what they could do. Some of those men tried to explain it to their children or grandchildren, but the explanations never quite captured the essential truth, that sometimes survival depended on silence, and silence depended on a mechanic who knew how to tune a damaged bolt to cycle like a whisper. In the end, Thomas Keane's legacy was measured not in recognition or awards, but in absences. The soldiers who didn't die in the Italian mountains, the families who got to welcome their sons and fathers home, the names that never appeared on casualty lists because one mechanic had improvised a solution to a problem no one had officially acknowledged existed. It was a kind of legacy that left no monuments, inspired no parades, merited no chapter in official histories. But for the men who survived those night patrols, who faced enemy scouts and walked away because their weapons didn't announce every chambered round of the darkness, it was a legacy that mattered most. They carried it home with them, an invisible debt to an invisible innovation, and they lived the lives that Thomas Keane's accidental discovery had made possible. And if that wasn't enough for the history books, it was more than enough for the men who lived to see their grandchildren, because a Nebraska farm kid had known when to break the rules and when to trust the evidence of his own ears. The modified carbines faded into obscurity, replaced by new weapons and new doctrine, forgotten by everyone except collectors who occasionally wonder about unusual bolt configurations, and veterans who remembered nights when silence was the difference between death and dawn. The Army moved on. Wars moved on. Technology moved on. But the principle remained, buried in lessons learned documents that no one read. That sometimes the most important innovations come from the bottom up, from mechanics and supply tends who see problems that staff officers never encounter, and that bureaucracy's greatest sin is not malice but inflexibility. Thomas Keane would have found it grimly amusing that his most important contribution to the war effort was erased from official records to protect the officers who had enabled it. But he also would have understood. He had been a soldier long enough to know that recognition was a luxury, and survival was the only metric that truly mattered. And by that metric, his success was absolute and undeniable, measured in negative space, and the casualties that never happened and the funerals that never took place. The jam bolt that became a silent striker saved more lives than anyone could count. And the mechanic who discovered asked for nothing more than the knowledge that his improvisation had mattered. In a war full of grand strategies and historic battles, it was a small thing, but to the men who came home because of it, it was everything.